The first thing Jemima Jackson learned after moving to Lagos was that the city had no sympathy for people who were struggling to survive. It was a place where dreams were either built into skyscrapers or crushed beneath the relentless wheels of progress, with no in-between. Every morning before the sun dared to fully crest the horizon, the air was already thick with the smell of exhaust, sweat, and opportunity. The traffic still flooded the roads, a chaotic ballet of yellow Danfo buses, battered cars, and luxury vehicles, all pressing forward in a desperate scramble. In this concrete jungle, the wealthy still hosted champagne parties in high-rise penthouses overlooking the tranquil turquoise ocean, oblivious to the world beneath. Clubs in Victoria Island still pulsed with music and strobe lights until dawn, celebrating success or drowning failure. While somewhere else in the same city, in a cramped room or a choked street, someone was praying desperately, with everything they had, for a miracle that would never come. And tonight, as the city lights began to glimmer maliciously, Jemima was beginning to fear that she, too, had run out of miracles. She stood quietly, a lone, still figure outside the massive, intimidating administration building of Echoed Atlantic Medical College, a prestigious institution that promised futures to those who could afford them. Jemima was not one of them. She was clutching a worn brown envelope tightly against her chest, as if it held not just paper, but her very heart, while students hurried past her, laughing, discussing exams, internships, weekend plans, lives unburdened by the weight she carried. Inside that envelope was every single naira she had managed to scrape together, sacrifice for, and save over the past 7 months. Every unbought meal, every extra shift, every moment of self-denial. But as she stood there, the weight of the envelope felt like nothing, because she knew it still wasn't enough. The merciless tuition payment deadline expired the following morning, and if she failed to complete the payment before then, her hard-won admission would be suspended immediately. Again, the thought alone made her chest tighten painfully, a physical sensation that mirrored the emotional suffocation she felt. Jemima? She looked up quickly, shaking herself out of her spiraling thoughts, as her best friend, Amaka, hurried down the stone staircase toward her with concern written all over her face. Amaka had seen this look before. "You're still here?" Amaka asked softly once she reached her, her voice barely audible over the hustle of other students. "Did the bursar agree to give you more time?" Jemima forced a weak smile onto her dry lips in an attempt to mask the crushing reality, but it disappeared almost immediately, leaving her face pale and drawn. "They refused," she said quietly, her voice sounding far away even to her own ears. "They said the school already gave me enough extensions." Amaka sighed heavily, the sound of defeated pragmatism. "Oh God, not again." Jemima looked away quickly, unable to make eye contact, before the hot tears gathering in her eyes could escape and fall freely in public. Everything in her life suddenly felt too heavy to bear, a relentless onslaught of challenges that refused to yield. Her father had died 3 years earlier, after a long, grueling illness that had completely drained the family financially, emotionally, and physically. Since then, her mother's tiny, struggling food stall in Surulere barely earned enough money to keep the family afloat, let alone pay for expensive medical tuition. Jemima had practically raised herself through university, balancing endless jobs after classes. She tutored secondary school students in the evenings until her voice was hoarse. She waitressed at expensive lounges in Lekki on weekends, smiling at rude patrons while her feet burned in cheap heels. She baked pastries and sold them whenever she could find a spare minute or any leftover ingredients. Still, survival, that elusive beast in Lagos, always stayed one agonizing step ahead of her. And now the cruelest blow of all. Her younger brother, Daniel, the one person she promised she would always protect, had fallen seriously ill. The resulting hospital bills, a cascade of unexpected costs, had swallowed nearly every naira she had so painstakingly kept aside for her tuition. "Maybe you should defer for one semester," Amaka suggested gently, though the hesitation in her eyes and the way she wouldn't look directly at her friend showed she already knew Jemima would hate the idea. Jemima shook her head immediately with a visceral refusal that came from the depths of her soul. "If I stop now, I might never come back," she whispered, her voice cracking painfully with unspeakable fear. "People always say they're taking a short break from school, but life happens, and suddenly the break becomes permanent and the dream dies." Amaka remained silent, her shoulders slumping, because both of them knew it was true. Lagos was a graveyard, filled with too many brilliant dreams swallowed by the necessity of survival. Jemima inhaled deeply, the humid Lagos air providing no comfort, and stared out at the busy road ahead of her where expensive cars sped past yellow buses filled with exhausted workers trying to survive another day. Somewhere in this city, there had to be an answer, even if finding it meant sacrificing her pride, her dignity, everything she had left. 3 hours later, Jemima found herself standing inside the magnificent lobby of one of the most luxurious, opulent hotels in Victoria Island, trying desperately not to look overwhelmed, small, and lost amidst the elegance surrounding her. The enormous crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling sparkled like thousands of diamonds beneath the warm golden lights, casting a dazzling glow on everything it touched. Wealth, power, and prestige floated quietly, almost invisibly, through the room in designer gowns, expensive perfume that made the air heavy, and conversations whispered over glasses of wine worth more than her monthly rent. Jemima suddenly became painfully, acutely aware of her simple black dress, already fraying at the seams, and her worn, scuffed heels that felt like they would collapse at any moment. "You're late." The deep, commanding, masculine voice behind her made her turn sharply, and instantly her heart stopped and she froze completely. Levi Suleiman stood near the private elevator, completely still, with one hand resting casually, yet purposefully, inside his pocket, his expression calm, unreadable, and intimidating without effort. Every rumor, every headline, every whisper she had ever heard about him suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. He was tall, devastatingly handsome in a cold, chiseled way, and dressed in a dark, tailored suit that looked effortlessly expensive, a second skin of power. But it was his eyes that unsettled her the most. Cold, controlled, dangerous, yet captivating. They were the kind of eyes that looked like they had seen too much, trusted absolutely no one, and knew how to dismantle a person with a single glance. Levi Suleiman, the youngest billionaire in Lagos, owner of Suleiman Holdings, the man newspapers and blogs described as ruthless, merciless, and emotionally untouchable, a man who built an empire on calculated decisions, not feelings. Jemima swallowed nervously, her throat dry, and tried to speak. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice trembling. Traffic was terrible. Levi stared at her silently for a few seconds that felt unbearably long, an evaluation that made her feel like a product on a shelf, before finally turning toward the waiting elevator without another word. "Come with me." There was no smile, no warmth, no reassurance, no attempt to make her comfortable, only absolute authority, and she was expected to follow. Jemima followed him nervously into the private elevator, while her heartbeat pounded violently, like a trapped bird, against her chest. She still could not believe she was here, doing this, considering this impossible thing. Earlier that afternoon, a woman from a private agency, a specter of opportunism, had approached her outside the school after overhearing her desperate, tearful argument with the heartless bursar. The woman had quietly, discreetly mentioned a financial arrangement, a delicate way of saying a business deal involving a woman's future for educated women willing to participate in temporary contractual partnerships. Jemima had nearly walked away immediately, her morals screaming, until she heard the amount involved. 20 million naira, enough to pay her tuition completely for the next 2 years. Enough to cover Daniel's hospital treatment and give him the best care money could buy. Enough to finally give her mother and her family breathing space for the first time in years. All she had to do was meet the client, and now, standing beside Levi Suleiman in the plush, silent elevator, she was beginning to regret saying yes, beginning to wonder what she was truly selling. The elevator doors opened directly into an enormous private suite that stretched across the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering, sprawling Lagos skyline. Levi removed his wristwatch calmly, a slow, methodical action before speaking again. "Sit down." Jemima obeyed, carefully lowering herself onto the edge of the large, plush velvet sofa, trying to calm the nervousness building inside her chest, a tremor she couldn't hide. A thick, oppressive silence settled between them, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Finally Levi spoke, his voice void of any emotion. "My grandmother is very ill." The statement, so human, so vulnerable coming from this man, caught her off guard completely. Jemima blinked in confusion, unsure of where this was going. "She recently underwent major surgery," he continued calmly, though his eyes never left hers, keeping her pinned. "The doctors are optimistic, but her health remains unstable, a delicate thread. At this point, there is only one thing she wants before she dies." Jemima stayed quiet, listening carefully, realizing she was being told a piece of his world. "She wants to see me married." Understanding slowly dawned on her face, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into a terrifying picture. Levi walked toward the large glass window, his silhouette dark against the city below, looking down at the world he dominated. I do not believe in relationships, he said flatly, with the conviction of a truth he had lived by. I do not believe in love, emotional dependency, or unnecessary attachments. His tone remained cold and detached, as though emotions themselves were an irritation, a flaw in the system. So, here is my offer, he said finally, turning back toward her, his gaze intense, demanding, "You become my wife temporarily." Jemima stared at him in disbelief, her mind trying to process the insanity. What? It will be a legal contract marriage, he explained, as if he were discussing a business merger. You will move into my house, attend public events with me, and act as my wife until my grandmother fully recovers. Then, we quietly divorce and you walk away. Her mind spun immediately, the words legal contract marriage echoing like a sentence. A fake marriage? Yes, no. The response escaped her mouth before she could stop herself, a reflexive act of self-preservation. I can't do that. Levi didn't react at all, his face as still as stone. You will be compensated generously. I said no, she repeated, standing abruptly to her feet, her whole body shaking. This is insane. Levi simply watched her, unmoving, unflinching. You need money, he said quietly, his voice like the low growl of a predator. Your brother needs treatment, or he might not survive, and your tuition payment deadline ends tomorrow morning. Jemima froze instantly, her entire world grinding to a halt. Fear, raw and visceral, flickered across her face. How do you know about my brother? She whispered, horrified by the invasion of her privacy. I make it my business to know everything before making important decisions, especially ones involving my personal life. Something about the calmness in his voice, the ease with which he invaded her private pain, unsettled her deeply. Levi stepped closer slowly, encroaching on her personal space, his presence massive. There will be rules, he continued, pushing his terms. No emotional attachment, no interference in my business affairs, and you will maintain discretion. In return, you will have complete freedom, privacy, and absolute financial security. Jemima folded her arms tightly across her chest, a frail attempt to protect herself. And if I refuse? Levi picked up the leather-bound contract from the table and placed it directly in front of her. Then you walk away. Simple. You leave here, you deal with your problems, you lose your dream. Cold. Precise. As though he were discussing a business transaction, instead of changing someone's entire life forever. Jemima stared silently at the papers, her thoughts battling violently inside her head. A storm of desperation and dignity. 20 million naira. Her brother's treatment, his life, her education, her future, her mother's relief, her family's salvation, or her pride, her morals, her self-respect. Tears burned painfully behind her eyes, hot and demanding. I would never sleep with you, she whispered shakily, the condition of her final surrender. Levi's expression remained unreadable, a wall she couldn't penetrate. You won't have to, he replied calmly, with no malice. I don't touch women who do not want me to, or who are not willing participants. For the first time since entering the suite, Jemima looked directly, deeply into his eyes. Beneath all the coldness, the control, the ruthlessness, she saw something unexpected hiding there, a tiny fracture. Loneliness. A deep, profound, terrifying loneliness, so carefully, so meticulously buried that most people would never notice it, and he would never admit to it. Levi placed an expensive pen beside the contract. Take your time. But time was exactly what Jemima no longer had. The clock was ticking. Daniel was lying in a hospital bed, waiting for medication that only this money could buy. Her tuition deadline expired in less than 24 hours, and her dreams were slipping away. Life, ruthless and efficient, had cornered her completely, leaving only one impossible path. Slowly, painfully, a tremor in her fingers, Jemima picked up the pen and, with a final silent prayer, signed her name on the dotted line, signing her life away. 2 weeks later, the fragile reality Jemima had built for herself shattered as Lagos exploded with the news. Headlines blared from every digital screen and morning paper, shouting that Levi Suleiman, the city's most elusive and feared billionaire, was officially engaged. Social media went into an absolute frenzy, with blogs splashing photographs of the mysterious, unknown woman who had overnight captured the heart of an untouchable titan. High society women whispered venomously at high-end boutiques, desperate to know who this outsider was and how she had managed to ensnare a man who had spent a decade rejecting the elite. Nobody knew the truth. Nobody knew that every time Jemima looked down at the massive, heavy diamond ring resting on her finger, She felt like a complete imposter trapped in an elaborate lie. Tonight was their official engagement dinner at Levi's sprawling Banana Island mansion, and the sheer anxiety of it made it difficult for her to draw breath. Inside the Grand Master Suite, an army of nervous stylists buzzed around her, adjusting the intricate lace of an elegant white designer dress that had been chosen specifically for the evening. "It fits perfectly, ma'am," one of the tailors whispered, terrified of making a mistake. Jemima stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back. She looked beautiful, sophisticated, and entirely fake, a flawless prop in Levi Suleiman's carefully orchestrated life. A soft, urgent knock broke her trance, and a butler announced that the high-profile guests had arrived. Her stomach tightened painfully. The charade was officially beginning. Stepping out of the room, she reached the top of a grand marble staircase that overlooked a breathtaking, cavernous hall. The mansion glittered with the oppressive weight of unchecked wealth and power. Politicians, famous celebrities, and powerful business moguls filled the room beneath towering crystal chandeliers, while soft, live classical music floated through the air. Then Levi looked up from the crowd, and suddenly the entire room seemed to disappear. He stood near the base of the stairs, dressed immaculately in a sharp, pitch-black suit. He had been conversing with an older businessman, a half-empty glass of champagne in his hand, but the exact second his eyes landed on Jemima, he stopped speaking entirely. The expression on his normally stoic face shifted instantly, revealing something dark, intense, and dangerously possessive. Jemima's breath caught sharply in her throat as she descended the staircase, hundreds of curious, judgmental eyes turning toward her like wolves tracking prey. Yet Levi never looked away from her once, his gaze locking her in place until she reached the bottom. "You look nervous," Levi murmured quietly, stepping in close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from him. "I am incredibly nervous," she admitted honestly, her voice trembling. His eyes traveled slowly over the white dress, hugging her curves before returning to her face, and for a fleeting moment, Levi Suleiman looked dangerously close to losing his legendary control. Bending down slightly, he whispered near her ear, "Maybe this marriage was a mistake," leaving her heart stumbling violently as he led her toward the predatory crowd. Living inside that Banana Island mansion quickly revealed itself to be less of a home and more of a beautiful gilded prison. Every single morning, Jemima woke up surrounded by luxury so expensive it genuinely frightened her, looking out over a pristine coastline where the ocean stretched endlessly beneath a golden sunrise. The house was an architectural marvel of glass walls and gleaming marble, filled with priceless artwork and silent staff members who moved through the corridors like ghosts. But despite the breathtaking beauty, the mansion never felt warm. It felt entirely hollow, a physical manifestation of the loneliness that Levi Suleiman had embraced for years. 2 weeks passed and the public's obsession only intensified, with television stations hiring body language experts to analyze their every movement during public appearances. Behind the flashing cameras and the forced, expensive smiles, however, their marriage remained strictly transactional, a cold contract, nothing more. Jemima had to constantly remind herself of this reality, especially on the quiet nights when she found herself completely alone with him. "You need to smile more when the media is present," Levi remarked coldly one evening, leaning back against the leather seat of his Rolls-Royce as they drove back from a grueling business dinner. Jemima turned to him, disbelief flaring in her eyes. "I did smile. I smiled until my face ached." Levi didn't look at her, keeping his gaze on the passing city lights. "You looked like you were attending a funeral." Jemima let out a bitter breath. "That's because your business partners look at me like they want to dissect me." To her utter amazement, the corner of Levi's mouth twitched slightly, a microscopic sign that he was fighting amusement. She realized then that the man rarely smiled. He simply allowed himself to soften for a split second before the ice closed over him again. Suddenly, the car ground to a halt outside the heavily guarded mansion gates, and the night exploded. Aggressive paparazzi and reporters swarmed the vehicle, their camera flashes blinding through the tinted windows. "Mr. Suleiman, is the wedding happening this year? Jemima, look over here. Are the gold digger rumors true?" Jemima instinctively froze, panic seizing her chest as the aggressive shouting grew louder. Sensing her terror, Levi reached across the seat and grabbed her hand, his large fingers wrapping firmly around hers. The sudden intense warmth of his touch startled her far more than the reporters did. "Stay close to me," he murmured urgently. The bodyguards threw the doors open, and a wall of flashing lights hit them like a physical blow. Levi stepped out first, shielding her body with his own, his arm resting protectively against her waist as he guided her through the shouting crowd. To the watching world, they were the ultimate power couple, untouchable, elegant, and perfectly matched. But the exact moment the heavy mansion doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off the noise of the street, reality returned with a vengeance. Levi released his grip on her waist instantly, stepping back and loosening his tie as if the proximity suffocated him. "You handled that well," he said, his voice reverting to its usual calm, businesslike tone as he walked toward the staircase. Jemima crossed her arms, feeling a sudden strange coldness where his hand had just been. "You could at least warn me before grabbing me like that in public. I am not a prop, Levi." Levi paused on the first step, turning back slowly. "You were visibly panicking. I did what was necessary." "That doesn't mean you should touch me unexpectedly," she shot back, her pride stinging. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unresolved, before Levi gave a short, respectful nod. "Noted." He disappeared upstairs, leaving Jemima standing alone in the massive foyer, trying to calm her racing pulse. Living with him was an exhausting psychological tightrope because she could never truly read him. Some days he ignored her existence entirely, and other days his eyes followed her every movement with an intensity that made her skin tingle. Seeking escape from the suffocating tension, Jemima buried herself in her medical textbooks, staying up until the early hours of the morning in the mansion's vast library. Tonight was no different. The clock on the wall read 1:17 a.m. As she sat curled on the velvet sofa, surrounded by anatomy notes and highlighter pens, desperately trying to prepare for her upcoming exams. She was so focused, biting the tip of her pen in deep thought, that she didn't hear the doors open. Levi stood silently in the doorway, watching her. He had just returned from an emergency board meeting, expecting the house to be asleep, but instead, he found her exactly where she always was. He loosened his cufflinks slowly, his eyes tracking the soft light of the desk lamp as it illuminated her face, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. She looked so real, so entirely uncorrupted by the superficial world he fought in every day. Jemima suddenly glanced up, gasping as she noticed his towering figure. "Oh my God, you scared me." Levi stepped into the room, his presence immediately shrinking the space. "You should be asleep," she sighed heavily, rubbing her tired eyes. "I can't. My final exams are next month, and if I fail, all of this sacrifice means absolutely nothing." Levi's eyes drifted down to the open pages in front of her. "You've been staring at that exact same diagram for the last 20 minutes. Jemima blinked, caught off guard. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything in this house," he replied quietly, his voice dropping an octave. Jemima looked down at her notes, her face flushing warmly under his intense gaze. Levi walked over to the private bar in the corner, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "You work yourself to the point of exhaustion." She let out a soft, dry laugh. "You say that like you don't spend 20 hours a day running an empire." "That's completely different," Levi said, taking a slow sip. "How is it different?" Jemima asked, genuinely curious. Levi paused, his eyes turning darker, filled with a sudden, heavy shadow. "I chose this ruthless life. You were forced into it." The raw honesty of his words hung in the air, revealing a tiny crack in his armor. But before she could ask him to explain, Levi turned his back to her, shutting the door on his emotions once again. The fragile peace they had found in the library shattered completely 3 nights later at a high society charity gala. The grand ballroom of the Oriental Hotel was packed with the elite of Lagos, a sea of diamonds, designer tuxedos, and fake smiles. Jemima felt like an alien, enduring cruel, audible whispers from women who didn't care if she heard them. "Look at her, trying so hard to fit in," a wealthy socialite sneered to her friends. "She clearly trapped him for his money. A girl from Surulere doesn't just stumble into billions unless she's a professional." Jemima kept her chin high, forcing a polite smile until the same socialite intentionally stepped forward, bumping into her and sending a full glass of red champagne cascading directly down the front of Jemima's white dress. "Oh dear, what a clumsy mistake," the woman said, her voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. Humiliation burned like fire through Jemima's veins as the surrounding crowd chuckled quietly. But before she could speak, Levi appeared out of nowhere. The temperature in the immediate area seemed to drop to sub-zero temperatures. "What happened here?" Levi asked, his voice terrifyingly calm, though his eyes were murderous as they locked onto the socialite. The woman's smile vanished, replaced by sudden terror. It was a complete accident, Mr. Suleiman." Levi didn't answer her, Instead, he took off his custom suit jacket and wrapped it gently around Jemima's stained shoulders. "We are leaving. Right now." The ride home was an agonizing, suffocating silence as torrential rain began to beat violently against the windows of the car. Jemima stared out into the dark Lagos night, fighting back the hot tears of anger and utter embarrassment that threatened to spill over. The moment the car pulled into the mansion, she bolted out, rushing upstairs to escape the nightmare of his world. 20 minutes later, after scrubbing her skin raw in a hot shower, she stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, emotionally drained and desperately needing comfort. Still dazed, she pushed open a heavy mahogany door, drying her damp hair with a towel, only to freeze in absolute horror. This was not her bedroom. Levi stood by the grand bed, in the middle of unbuttoning his shirt. Her heart stopped. In her exhaustion, she had walked straight into Levi's private quarters, and to make matters infinitely worse, she was wearing nothing but one of his oversized white button-down shirts that she had taken from the laundry after her own clothes were ruined. For several agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. The heavy tropical rain crashed against the glass walls as an electric, undeniable tension filled the room. Levi slowly looked up, his gaze sweeping over her, and completely lost his train of thought. The loose shirt rested high on her thighs, revealing her bare legs, while her damp hair framed a face flushed with pure embarrassment. Jemima became hyper-aware of every breath she took, the sheer intimacy of the moment paralyzing her. "I am so sorry," she whispered desperately, her voice cracking. "I took a wrong turn. I thought this was my room." Levi said absolutely nothing. His eyes, usually so cold and calculated, burned with a sudden fierce hunger that terrified and exhilarated her all at once. He stared at her for one dangerous second, then two, then three, his chest rising and falling heavily. Finally, he turned his face away sharply, clenching his fists as he forced his entire body into submission. "You need to leave this room immediately," he said, his voice completely different, ruer, deeper, and completely strained. "Right," Jemima breathed, turning rapidly toward the exit. But just as her hand touched the gold handle, his voice stopped her dead in her tracks. "Jemima," she paused, her heart hammering against her ribs like a drum. Slowly, fearfully, she looked back over her shoulder. Levi was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. A chaotic mix of deep conflict, intense vulnerability, and raw desire. And in that quiet, stormy room, the terrifying truth became clear. The cold, unyielding billionaire was completely losing control of his heart. Jemima Jackson promised herself from the very beginning that falling in love with Levi Suleiman would be the worst mistake she could ever make, an absolute disaster from which her heart would never recover. That solemn promise became her daily shield, an emotional armor she wore every single day she spent navigating the cold, echoing corridors of his massive Banana Island mansion. Because men like Levi Suleiman did not belong to ordinary women like her. They belonged to the world of cutthroat business, high-stakes finance, and ruthless headlines. He was too powerful, too wealthy, too emotionally distant, and surrounded by a dark cloud of rumors that would make any sensible woman pack her bags and run in the exact opposite direction. Newspapers called him a merciless tyrant. Business rivals described him as an unfeeling machine. Even the high society elites who smiled politely to his face whispered terrifying stories about how cold and untouchable he truly was behind closed doors. Jemima had believed every single one of those stories, desperately using them to keep her own growing feelings at bay. But the insidious problem with living beside someone day after day, sharing the same quiet spaces and breathing the same air, was that eventually the cracks in the armor began to show, and you began to see the vulnerable human being the world never noticed. Slowly, dangerously, and with a terrifying inevitability, Jemima was beginning to see the wounded man beneath the ruthless billionaire headlines. It started with his grandmother, Madame Suleiman, who remained one of the warmest, most genuinely loving people Jemima had ever met since her arrival in the unforgiving city of Lagos. Despite her fragile, failing health, the matriarch still carried herself with an innate elegance and a quiet strength that naturally filled every room she entered. The older woman adored Jemima completely, treating her not as a contractual obligation, but as the daughter she had always prayed for. "You have brought real life back into this hollow house, my dear," Madame Suleiman told her one quiet afternoon while they sat together on the expansive balcony, watching the gray ocean waves crash against the rocks below. Jemima smiled softly, shaking her head. "I think Levi only brought me here mainly to make you happy, ma'am." Madame Suleiman laughed quietly, a frail, wheezing sound that quickly turned into a sad sigh. That boy has not been truly happy for a single day since the night his parents died. The unexpected revelation caught Jemima's attention immediately, her eyes widening as she turned slightly toward the older woman. Levi rarely, if ever, spoke about his personal life, his childhood, or his family. In fact, he barely spoke about anything that wasn't directly related to his grueling work schedule. He hides his immense pain very well behind those high walls, Madame Suleiman continued softly, her wrinkled hand reaching out to pat Jemima's. But loneliness changes a person, child. It hardens the softest heart. Jemima looked down thoughtfully at the lukewarm tea in her hands, her mind racing. Loneliness, that heavy, suffocating word seemed to follow Levi everywhere he went, clinging to him like a second shadow. Even inside a sprawling mansion packed to the brim with domestic staff, armed bodyguards, personal assistants, and endless, ringing business calls, he still somehow seemed completely and utterly alone in the world. And for reasons she could not logically explain, that profound realization affected her deeply, chipping away at the defense mechanisms she had worked so hard to build. Later that night, unable to sleep as her mind replayed the conversation, Jemima woke up thirsty and quietly left her bedroom to get a glass of water from the dark kitchen downstairs. The mansion remained dead silent, except for the rhythmic, melancholy sound of heavy tropical rain hitting the glass windows. As she walked back up the dimly lit corridor, past Madame Suleiman's room, she noticed the heavy mahogany door was slightly ajar, a warm sliver of light spilling out onto the cold, marble floor. Fearing something was wrong, she stopped and peeked inside, and the sight before her made her breath hitch in her throat. Levi was sitting on a low stool directly beside his grandmother's bed, absolute exhaustion and raw vulnerability written all over his face. His expensive suit jacket rested carelessly across a chair nearby, his tie was completely gone, and his crisp white sleeves were rolled up loosely to his elbows. One of his large, powerful hands held his grandmother's fragile, wrinkled fingers with a gentleness that seemed entirely impossible for a man labeled as ruthless, while his other hand rubbed tiredly across his furrowed forehead. He looked nothing like the cold billionaire the media feared. He looked entirely human, broken, and deeply terrified of losing the only family he had left. Jemima stayed completely frozen by the doorway, watching quietly in the shadows as Madame Suleiman slept peacefully under the heavy blankets, while Levi remained wide awake, vigilantly guarding her like a silent protector. He had probably been sitting there for hours in the dark, carrying the weight of his empire and his grief all by himself. Suddenly, without warning, Levi spoke softly into the silence, his voice deep and gravelly, never once looking up from his grandmother's face. "How long are you planning to stand there in the dark, Jemima?" Jemima nearly jumped out of her skin, her heart hammering against her ribs. You knew I was here?" Levi finally turned his head toward the doorway, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a heavy magnetic intensity. "I told you before. I notice everything." The familiar, confident response made something warm and dangerously tender flicker briefly inside her chest. Jemima stepped into the warm room carefully, her bare feet silent on the rug. "You should sleep, Levi," she whispered softly, her eyes filled with genuine concern. "You have a massive board meeting tomorrow morning." Levi glanced back toward his sleeping grandmother, his jaw clenching slightly. "She had severe chest pains earlier this evening before you came home." Panic immediately crossed Jemima's face as her medical training kicked in. "Is she okay? Did the cardiologist come?" "The doctor said it's stress and a weakened heart," Levi replied, a rare note of helplessness creeping into his voice. A heavy, intimate silence settled quietly between them as they stood over the bed. Then Jemima looked at him carefully, seeing past the billionaire facade. "You love her very much, don't you?" For a split second, Levi's rigid expression softened almost painfully, the mask slipping completely. "She raised me," he said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. "After my parents were killed in that accident, she became my everything. The only person who didn't want something from me." Jemima's chest tightened unexpectedly, a wave of profound empathy washing over her as the pieces of his complex puzzle finally clicked together. The emotional distance, the terrifying coldness, the impenetrable walls around his heart. It all made sense now. Levi had spent his entire adult life surviving agonizing grief and betrayal, by shutting the entire world out, treating life as a business transaction where no one could hurt him again. Before she could stop herself, driven by a pure, unselfish instinct to comfort him, Jemima stepped closer and placed a gentle, warm hand on his tense shoulder. "It's going to be okay, Levi," she whispered, her voice a soothing balm in the dark room. Levi slowly looked up at her hand on his shoulder, then up into her eyes, and for one dangerous, electric second, the entire air between them shifted completely. His eyes lingered on her face, tracking the soft curve of her lips, staying there for a beat too long. Jemima's heartbeat stumbled instantly, the proximity making her dizzy. Then, as if snapping back to reality, Levi looked away first, his posture rigid once more. "You should go back to bed, Jemima," he murmured quietly, closing himself off. And somehow the deep, hollow disappointment she felt as she walked back to her empty room, confused and terrified her more than anything else. The following week became even more dangerous for Jemima's fragile heart, because Levi started changing in ways she never could have anticipated. It wasn't a sudden dramatic shift, but rather a series of quiet, subtle actions that spoke louder than any words ever could. One Monday morning, she rushed downstairs, completely late for her lectures, only to find Levi waiting patiently beside the grand dining table, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit with his car keys resting in his hand. "Aren't you leaving for your office in Victoria Island?" she asked in utter confusion, looking around for his usual entourage of drivers. "I'm taking you to school myself today," Levi replied calmly. His tone brooked no argument. Jemima blinked in disbelief. "You don't have to do that, Levi. Your time is worth millions." "I know," he answered simply, walking past her toward the door. The drive through the notoriously chaotic Lagos traffic felt strangely peaceful that morning. For once, there were no aggressive reporters trailing them, no flashing cameras, and no need to pretend for the public. There was only a comfortable silence and soft jazz music playing quietly from the car's premium speakers. "You have your major pathology exams soon," Levi said suddenly, keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the crowded road ahead. Jemima sighed tiredly, leaning her head against the cool glass window. "I'm trying my absolute best not to panic, but the pressure is immense." "You will pass," Levi said, his voice filled with an unshakable conviction. Jemima smiled faintly. "You sound incredibly confident for someone who has never seen my report cards." Levi glanced at her briefly, a soft look in his eyes. "You're much smarter and more resilient than most of the people I surround myself with." The unexpected, genuine compliment caught her off guard completely, sending a thrill of joy through her veins. Before she could find the words to reply, the luxury vehicle ground to a smooth halt directly outside the bustling gates of Echo Atlantic Medical College. Several students immediately stopped in their tracks, openly staring and whispering at the incredibly expensive car. Jemima groaned softly, covering her face. "Wonderful. Now everyone on campus will gossip about me for the next 10 years. To her absolute amazement, Levi looked almost amused, his lips twitching into the first real, proper smile she had ever seen on him. It was a stunning, breathtaking smile that completely transformed his harsh features. "They already gossip about you, Jemima. Let them talk." And in that exact moment, Jemima's heart reacted instantly in the most dangerous way possible. She realized she was falling completely, hopelessly in love with her fake husband. 3 days later, she returned home exhausted after a grueling 9-hour day of lectures, only to discover several heavy, brand-new medical textbooks arranged neatly across her study desk. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she ran her fingers over the glossy covers. These were advanced, rare international editions she had been desperately searching for online for months, books she could never dream of affording on her own. Slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and confusion, she walked downstairs toward Levi's private office. The heavy oak door remained slightly open, and she could hear his voice from inside. Levi sat behind his massive desk, reviewing legal documents while speaking into his phone in a cold, ruthless voice that reminded her exactly why the entire business world feared him. "No, I don't care about their excuses," he said flatly, his eyes icy. "If they miss the funding deadline again, terminate the contract completely and sue them for damages." Jemima hesitated briefly by the door, clearing her throat before knocking softly. Levi looked up immediately, and the transformation was instantaneous. The terrifying, ruthless billionaire vanished, and his harsh expression softened the moment his eyes landed on her. He ended the multi-million naira call without a single second of hesitation, setting the phone aside. "What is it, Jemima?" "The textbooks upstairs in my room," she began carefully, her voice soft. "Yes, you bought them for me." Levi leaned back calmly in his leather chair, crossing his arms. "You needed them for your upcoming exams, didn't you?" But they are incredibly expensive and hard to find in Nigeria, she pressed, stepping fully into the room. And? Your education is important, Levi replied smoothly, as if buying rare medical texts was as simple as buying a loaf of bread. Jemima stared at him speechlessly, her heart swelling with an emotion so intense it frightened her. Nobody in her life, outside of her struggling mother, had ever shown her such effortless, protective kindness before. Thank you, Levi. Truly, she whispered sincerely, her eyes shining. For a long, quiet moment, Levi simply looked at her, his intense gaze drifting toward the tired, dark shadows beneath her eyes. You're overworking yourself to the point of collapse again, Jemima. She laughed softly, the tension melting away. You sound exactly like my mother. Then you should start listening to her more often, he murmured. And once again Levi looked at her in that strange, intense, unreadable way that made her chest feel too tight and her breath catch in her throat. Unfortunately, the harsh reality of their fake arrangement returned with a vengeance during a formal Suleiman family dinner held that Saturday night. The enormous, cavernous dining hall glittered beneath massive crystal chandeliers, while wealthy, judgmental members of the extended Suleiman family filled the long table, dressed in diamonds, heavy gold, and supreme arrogance. Jemima felt deeply uncomfortable before the first course was even served, suffocating under the weight of their collective disdain. Several of Levi's aunts and cousins barely hid their absolute disapproval of her humble background. One older woman, dripping in pearls, openly asked what neighborhood in Surulere Gemma's mother lived in before all this sudden good luck happened to her daughter. Another cousin loudly questioned whether struggling medical students were now using marriage to billionaires as a lucrative side hustle. Jemima kept her head high, forcing a polite, painful smile despite the burning humiliation and hot tears stinging the back of her eyelids. But before she could swallow her pride, Levi spoke, his voice cutting through the chatter like an icy blade. If anyone at this table insults or disrespects my wife again, you can stand up, leave my house immediately, and consider your monthly allowances permanently canceled. An absolute terrified silence crashed instantly across the entire dining hall, the wealthy relatives turning pale. Jemima turned toward Levi in pure shock, her heart racing as he continued eating his meal calmly, as if he had not just threatened his entire lineage for her sake. But before anyone could muster up an apology, a smooth, mocking voice interrupted from the grand arched doorway. Well, well, this dinner looks far more interesting than I expected. The entire room froze completely, the tension instantly multiplying by 100. Jemima slowly looked up toward the entrance and immediately understood why the atmosphere had turned deadly. The woman standing there was breathtakingly beautiful, tall, mixed race, elegant, and radiating a dangerous, high society confidence. Her fitted black designer dress hugged her flawless figure perfectly, and every step she took into the room screamed old money and absolute power. She smiled directly and familiarly at Levi. Hello, darling. Did you miss me? Jemima's stomach twisted into a painful, icy knot as she watched the woman approach. Levi's expression darkened into something truly terrifying, his fists clenching beneath the table. Vanessa, the woman, Levi's wealthy ex-fiancée, walked toward him with a slow, predatory grace before leaning down to kiss his cheek naturally, a casual gesture that screamed she belonged in his world far more than Jemima ever could. I just returned from my holiday in London, Vanessa said smoothly, her eyes scanning the terrified relatives before landing on Jemima. You didn't honestly think I would miss a family dinner, did you, Levi? Jemima suddenly felt small, exposed, and acutely aware of the massive diamond ring on her finger, which now felt heavy and fraudulent. Vanessa finally turned her full attention toward her, offering a brilliant smile that looked perfectly polite, but felt razor-sharp underneath. So, Vanessa said softly, her eyes narrowing as she studied Jemima from head to toe like an unwanted insect. You must be the new temporary little wife everyone in Lagos is whispering about. An ugly, agonizing twist of pure jealousy and deep insecurity ripped through Jemima's chest, and for the first time since entering Levi's complicated world, she realized she was in far more danger of breaking her own heart than she had ever imagined. Lagos loved scandals almost as much as it loved money, consuming the downfalls of the powerful like wildfire, and by sunrise, Jemima Jackson had become the absolute epicenter of the biggest, most explosive scandal in the entire country. The devastating headline exploded across every major blog, newspaper, social media feed, and entertainment channel before she had even fully opened her eyes. Levi Suleiman's marriage exposed as a sham business contract. Beneath the bold, mocking text were high resolution, leaked photographs of the confidential legal agreement she had signed months earlier inside that private Victoria Island hotel suite. Several highly sensitive pages of the contract had somehow been scanned and broadcasted to the world, detailing the exact 20 million naira payment arrangement, the non-disclosure clauses, and the strictly temporary nature of their union. By 8 in the morning, the internet was tearing her dignity to pieces, with millions of anonymous accounts labeling her a gold digger, a desperate opportunist, a professional manipulator, and a poor girl who had sold her soul and her body for quick cash. Jemima sat paralyzed on the edge of her bed, staring silently at her phone screen as thousands of hateful, venomous comments flooded her notifications endlessly. To make the nightmare complete, whoever had leaked the documents had also dug up and published deeply private details about her family's financial struggles, her agonizing tuition deadlines, and her younger brother Daniel's severe illness. Her public humiliation was absolute and crushing. The whole world was looking at her most desperate moment of vulnerability and laughing at it. She trapped him, the comments shouted. She sold herself for 20 million naira. The cruel words blurred together through a thick veil of hot, agonizing tears. A sharp, commanding knock shattered the suffocating silence of her bedroom, and the door swung open before she could even answer. Levi entered the room, fully dressed in a black suit, his face completely pale and his expression colder and more terrifying than she had ever seen it before. For a long, painful second, neither of them spoke a word. Jemima quickly locked her phone, trying desperately to wipe her face, but Levi had already seen the tears streaming down her cheeks. "My elite legal team is already handling the leaks," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, though a dangerous, murderous anger simmered just beneath every single syllable. "The websites and servers responsible for publishing those documents will be completely shut down and sued out of existence before this evening." Jemima let out a bitter, heartbroken laugh, her voice trembling with despair. "You think deleting a few blogs changes anything now, Levi? You think that fixes what has been done?" Levi's jaw tightened sharply, a muscle leaping in his cheek. Outside the reinforced mansion gates, the muffled sounds of chaos could be heard. Aggressive reporters were screaming questions through megaphones. Camera flashes were exploding like lightning against the security walls. News helicopters were literally circling above the Banana Island neighborhood, like vultures hunting fresh drama. The entire city had turned against them overnight, or rather, they had turned against her, making her the villain of the story. "This is a temporary storm, Jemima. It will pass," Levi said quietly, stepping closer to her. Jemima looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and betrayal. "Pass," she whispered, her voice cracking painfully. "What?" "They published my entire life, my family's poverty, and my brother's medical trauma for national entertainment. My classmates saw this. My professors saw this. My mother is probably crying her eyes out in Surulere right now, because the whole country thinks her daughter prostituted herself just to pay school fees." The raw, bleeding pain in her voice was undeniable. For the first time since she had met him, the legendary, untouchable Levi Suleiman looked genuinely unsettled, almost broken, by the sight of her agony. "I never intended for your family to be dragged into my dark world," he said, his voice dropping low. "But it did happen, Levi." "It happened because I signed that piece of paper," she shouted, standing up abruptly from the bed, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Levi remained dead silent for several agonizing seconds, absorbing her anger before fixing his cold gaze back on the door. "Stay inside the mansion today," he ordered, the authoritative billionaire mask returning to his face. "I have already doubled the armed security perimeter. No one can touch you here." Then he turned sharply on his heel, walking toward the exit. "Levy," she called out, stopping him dead in his tracks. He paused, his back still turned to her. Jemima swallowed the painful lump in her throat, forcing herself to ask the one question that had been poisoning her mind since the moment she woke up. Did Vanessa leak the contract? Levi's posture went entirely rigid, his shoulders locking up, and his expression darkened into pure fury. "I do not know for certain yet," he replied, but the dangerous, deathly calmness in his tone told her everything she needed to know. He already knew the culprit, and there would be blood. As the hours crawled by, the national scandal only intensified, transforming into a feeding frenzy. Television stations replayed the breaking story on a continuous loop, bringing on social commentators to debate whether Levi Suleiman had cruelly manipulated a financially desperate student, or, if Jemima was a calculated blackmailer who had weaponized her tears to trap a billionaire. Nobody cared about the human beings caught in the middle. They only wanted the spectacle. By mid-afternoon, the chaos had spread to the corporate world, with hundreds of media personnel completely surrounding the Suleiman Holdings headquarters in Victoria Island. High-profile investors began to panic, causing the company's stock shares to plummet drastically on the market. Yet, on the outside, Levi remained terrifyingly collected as he navigated the crisis. Inside his top-floor executive office, however, the air was suffocatingly tense. "You must release an official public statement immediately, Levi," his chief corporate lawyer insisted nervously, wiping sweat from his forehead. "If we do not control the narrative within the hour, the board of directors will convene and demand your temporary resignation." Levi stood completely still by the massive glass window, looking down at the swarming crowds below like an angry god. "Find the internal traitor who pulled the files from my secure vault first," he commanded, his voice dripping with ice. "We already have undeniable digital footprints pointing directly to Vanessa Ibrahim's personal assistant," the lawyer admitted shakily. Levi's eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated venom. Vanessa. His narcissistic ex-fiancée had always hated losing control over him, but this move went beyond corporate warfare. This was a malicious, calculated attempt to utterly destroy an innocent girl's life just out of spite. And the realization that Jemima was suffering solely because she was associated with him cut through Levi's cold heart, deeper than any financial loss ever could. Another assistant burst into the office, visibly trembling. "Sir, the paparazzi are getting completely out of hand. Security just reported that a group of rogue reporters tried to forcefully gain access to Madame Jemima's mother's food stall in Surulere." Something vital inside Levi snapped violently, an explosion of pure rage erupting from him. He slammed his fist down onto the mahogany desk, shattering a glass paperweight into tiny fragments. "Deploy my personal security detail to Surulere immediately," he roared, his voice echoing like thunder through the boardroom. "If a single camera, a single reporter, or a single civilian goes within 10 feet of her family, break them. There will be catastrophic consequences for anyone who tests me today." The terrified assistant scrambled out of the room instantly. Levi closed his inhaling sharply as a wave of unfamiliar guilt washed over him. For months, he had stubbornly convinced himself that the legal contract was a perfect shield, a clean business arrangement that would protect everyone involved. Now, he was forced to face the brutal truth. His wealth and his toxic world had placed a beautiful, innocent soul directly in the line of fire. Back at the grand mansion, Jemima had reached her breaking point. Arriving at a painful, inevitable conclusion, she could not survive this ruthless high society world. No matter how much wealth surrounded her, and no matter how heavily Levi protected her, she would always be viewed as an outcast, a piece of trash to be stepped on by elite monsters like Vanessa. The Suleiman name did not bring peace. It brought war, enemies, betrayal, and a level of cruelty she was never equipped to handle. And worse, far worse than the public scandal itself, was the terrifying realization that she was desperately, completely, in love with the very man who had brought this chaos upon her. That love terrified her to her core, shaking the foundations of her sanity. With tears blinding her vision, Jemima slowly began packing her modest clothes back into her old suitcase, her hands trembling as she folded each garment. This was always supposed to be a temporary arrangement, a strictly professional business deal to save her brother and her education, nothing more. But somewhere between those late-night study sessions in the quiet library, the gentle warmth of his hand protecting her from the crowds, and the rare, breathtaking way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, the lie had become her absolute reality. A soft, hesitant knock interrupted her, and the door pushed open to reveal Madame Suleiman, leaning heavily on her cane, her face lined with deep sorrow. The older woman's eyes immediately fell upon the packed suitcase, and her expression softened into profound sadness. "You are leaving us, aren't you, my child?" she asked, her voice frail but heavy with emotion. Jemima lowered her gaze, unable to look the matriarch in the eye. "I have to, ma'am. I think it is the best thing for everyone involved." Madame Suleiman walked into the room slowly, placing a comforting, warm hand on Jemima's trembling shoulder. "Look at me, Jemima. Do you love my grandson?" The direct question pierced straight through her defenses, hitting too close to the bleeding truth. "I shouldn't, ma'am," Jemima whispered painfully, her voice cracking as a fresh wave of tears fell. "But you do," the wise old woman insisted gently. I do, Jemima confessed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. But he deserves someone who belongs in his magnificent world, someone who can help him fight his battles, not a poor student who brings shame and scandal to his name. Madame Suleiman smiled a sad, knowing smile, shaking her head. My boy has spent his entire adult life surrounded by wealthy, sophisticated women who were perfectly suited for his world, Jemima. And do you know what? Not a single one of them ever made him truly smile. Not a single one of them ever brought peace to his tortured soul until you walked through that door. Jemima turned away quickly, her heart breaking into a million pieces. I can't stay here anymore, ma'am. Everywhere I look, people are viewing me like I am absolutely nothing. Madame Suleiman gently turned her face back, her eyes filled with an intense seriousness. And what about how Levi looks at you, child? Have you looked closely at his eyes lately? Jemima's breath caught sharply in her throat, because that was the true, terrifying problem. Levi no longer looked at her like she was a line item in a legal document. He looked at her like she was his entire universe, and she was terrified of what that meant for both of them. Determined to end the madness before she lost her mind completely, Jemima waited until dusk, slipped out of the mansion through a service exit, and took a taxi directly to the Suleiman Holdings headquarters, resolved to face the dragon and terminate everything. A torrential downpour was hammering across Victoria Island, matching the violent storm in her chest as the taxi pulled up to the corporate tower. Protesters and aggressive media personnel were still crowded outside the entrance under umbrellas, shouting and waving signs. The exact moment Jemima stepped out of the vehicle, the crowd spotted her and rushed forward like a pack of wild animals, heavy cameras shoving into her face. Jemima! Did you legally marry him just for the 20 million naira? Did Levi Suleiman blackmail you into this contract? Is the fake marriage officially over? A wall of elite security guards quickly swarmed around her, physically pushing the aggressive reporters back and escorting her into the grand, secure lobby before she could completely break down in front of the cameras. Minutes later, the private elevator doors opened, and she marched into Levi's massive executive office, her body trembling with a mixture of cold rain and pure emotional exhaustion, while violent cracks of thunder shook the massive glass windows behind his desk. Levi looked up from his work immediately, his eyes tracking her movement. But the moment his gaze landed on the old suitcase clutched tightly in her hand, the temperature in the room plummeted. Everything inside his expression darkened into a terrifying, lethal shadow. He stood up slowly from his leather chair, towering over the room. What is the meaning of this, Jemima? Jemima forced herself to stand tall, swallowing her fear as she looked directly into his eyes. I am leaving, Levi. I am officially terminating the arrangement. An absolute, dangerous silence descended upon the office, heavy with unexploded tension. Levi walked out from behind his desk, his steps slow, deliberate, and menacing. No, you are not leaving. The single absolute word sent a jolt of panic through her veins, but she refused to back down now. This sick arrangement is completely destroying both of us, she cried out, her voice echoing off the glass walls. The secret contract is already ruined and exposed to the public anyway, so there is absolutely no point in us pretending to be a happy couple anymore. Let me go back to my real life. Levi stopped directly in front of her, mere inches away, his massive frame completely eclipsing her. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like marble, his chest heaving with an emotion he could no longer contain. For months, he had successfully governed, suppressed, and locked away every single intense feeling this girl had ignited inside his frozen soul. But looking at her suitcase, he knew he had lost the war. You honestly think this entire situation is still about a piece of paper, Jemima? You think this is still about a stupid contract? He demanded, his voice dropping into a low, rough growl that vibrated through her entire body. What else could it possibly be about to a man like you? She shot back, tears spilling over her eyelashes. You want the absolute truth? He roared suddenly, his legendary composure shattering completely, exposing the raw, bleeding heart of the man underneath. Jemima's heart skipped a beat, her breath completely paralyzing her. Levi grabbed her upper arms, his grip firm but careful, his eyes burning into hers with a terrifying, overwhelming intensity. The truth is that somewhere along this miserable line you stopped being temporary to me, Jemima. You stopped being a deal. Her breath hitched, her eyes widening in sheer shock as he confessed his soul. Levi's voice grew rougher, thick with an agonizing vulnerability he had never allowed another human being to see. You became the single solitary person I look for the second I open my eyes every morning. You became the only reason I even want to return to that empty, hollow mansion at night. You became my absolute peace, Jemima, my obsession, my fatal weakness. The only woman on this entire earth capable of destroying me with a single look, and you want to pack a bag and tell me it's just a contract? Deep emotional tears filled Jemima's eyes instantly, her chest heaving as the weight of his profound confession crashed over her like a tidal wave. Levy? No, please don't say that, she whispered, her heart breaking for him. No, I will say it, he interrupted sharply, his fingers tightening slightly on her arms. You do not get to just walk out of my life pretending that this meant absolutely nothing to me, that I don't care about you. You have completely unraveled me. The tropical storm outside intensified violently, lightning flashing across the Lagos sky, illuminating the raw passion and desperation burning between them in the dark office. Jemima stepped backward shakily, her head spinning. But the whole city hates me, Levi. The whole country thinks I am disgusting, that I sold myself. Levi moved with her, closing the distance instantly until his face was inches from hers, his eyes projecting a dark protective fury that stole the very air from her lungs. Then, he delivered the words that would echo in her soul for the rest of her life. If this entire city turns its back against you, Jemima, he whispered darkly, his voice thick with an unshakable promise, then I will gladly turn this entire city upside down and burn it to the ground just to keep you safe. The sheer, absolute intensity in his burning eyes took her breath away completely, because for the first time since she had signed that fateful contract, Jemima finally understood the terrifying truth, the coldest, most feared billionaire in Lagos was no longer protecting a business agreement. He was desperately, fiercely protecting the woman he loved with every broken piece of his soul. By the time the explosive scandal surrounding their contract marriage finally began fading from the national headlines, Levi Suleiman had already made one thing painfully, undeniably clear to every single soul in Lagos. Jemima Jackson was no longer an outsider to be mocked or an untouchable pawn to be used. She was protected by him, and Levi protected what belonged to him with a frightening, lethal intensity that left no room for negotiation. The elite circles of the city noticed the dramatic shift immediately. He stopped shielding her from the predatory glare of the media and started standing proudly beside her openly instead, asserting her rightful place by his side. He attended her medical school charity events personally, sitting in the front row and matching every donation 10 times over. He walked into the most exclusive restaurants in Ikoyi with her hand resting confidently, tightly inside his, daring anyone to whisper. He even famously shut down a live television interview halfway through, tearing off his microphone and walking out after the host tried to insult Jemima indirectly with a masked question. The public called it an unhealthy obsession, an unhinged fixation. Perhaps they were completely right, because Levi no longer cared about maintaining his pristine corporate mask or pretending otherwise to please investors. For the first time in his entire guarded life, a living, breathing human being mattered to him infinitely more than raw power, stock market shares, and absolute control. Unfortunately, loving a man like Levi Suleiman meant inheriting a dangerous world of buried secrets and deeply entrenched enemies who had been waiting in the shadows for years. 3 nights later, Jemima finally understood just how perilous and dark his world truly was. The Banana Island mansion had already gone completely quiet for the night. The staff dismissed to their quarters when she walked downstairs, looking for a glass of water, after another exhausting multi-hour study session. A heavy dark rain fell relentlessly against the glass windows, while distant thunder echoed ominously across the coastline. As she passed the corridor leading to Levi's private office, the muffled sound of heated voices inside made her slow down, her instincts flaring. The heavy oak door remained slightly open, casting a sharp wedge of yellow light onto the marble floor. "You are becoming incredibly careless, Levi," an older, powerful man said sharply from inside the room, his tone dripping with corporate malice. "The board members are already deeply nervous after that contract leak, and the company shares are unstable." Jemima immediately recognized the gravelly, authoritative voice. It belonged to Chief Balagun, one of Levi's oldest, most trusted business partners and a longtime ally of his late father. Levi's cold, razor-sharp voice followed instantly, cutting through the critique. "I am handling the market variables, Chief. My personal life does not dictate my corporate capability." "You are dangerously distracted," Chief Balagun continued, raising his voice, the sound of a predator sensing a weakness. "Ever since that insignificant girl entered your life, You have been making emotional, soft decisions. Your father completely destroyed this family's legacy once before because of a foolish thing called love. Do not repeat his catastrophic mistake. A suffocating, dangerous silence followed the older man's words. When Levi finally answered, his voice did not rise. Instead, it dropped into a terrifyingly calm, deathly whisper that made the hairs on Jemima's arms stand up. Mention my father's tragedy again, or try to interfere with my wife, and our multi-billion naira partnership ends tonight. I will ruin you before sunrise. The absolute lethality of the threat made even Jemima shiver in the dark hallway. She quietly stepped back, retreating into the shadows before either man could notice her standing there, but her heartbeat remained wildly uneven all the way back to her bedroom. For the first time, a real deep-seated fear settled inside her chest. Levi's world was infinitely darker than she had ever imagined, and the closer she became to him, the more dangerous everything around him seemed to become. The following week only stretched the tension to a breaking point. Levi became increasingly rigid, disappearing into endless secretive meetings and returning home past midnight with a bone-deep exhaustion written across his handsome face. Something massive was shifting behind the scenes, a corporate coup or a personal vendetta, and although he tried his best to hide the stress from her, Jemima noticed the sudden influx of extra, heavily armed security guards surrounding the mansion immediately. There were more patrol cars, more surveillance cameras, and a thick, heavy layer of operational anxiety hanging over the estate. You're genuinely scaring me, Levi, she admitted quietly one evening while they sat alone on the dark balcony, the ocean breeze whipping her hair across her face. Levi looked up slowly from a thick stack of legal documents in his hands, his eyes shadowed. You have nothing to fear, Jemima. You are entirely safe here. That wasn't my question, and you know it, she pressed, her voice soft but unyielding. For a long second, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crashing of the tide below. Then, Levi exhaled a long, heavy breath, placing the corporate papers aside on the table. My father made powerful, bitter enemies before he died, he confessed quietly, looking out at the dark water. Some people in this city have been waiting patiently for over a decade for an opportunity to weaken the Suleiman name, to find a fracture in my armor. Jemima's chest tightened painfully. Now? They think this public scandal and my feelings for you have made me vulnerable, soft, targetable. The calm, calculated way he said it frightened her to her very core. Because Levi did not sound worried for his own life, his wealth, or his status. He sounded completely terrified for her survival. Jemima moved closer to him carefully, her hand hovering over his. Maybe all of this misery is happening because of me. If I hadn't signed that contract. Levi's expression hardened instantly, his eyes flashing with sudden fierce anger. No, do not ever say that. But ever since I came into your life, your empire has been under attack. This has absolutely nothing to do with your worth, Jemima. His voice came out much sharper and louder than he intended, echoing in the quiet night. Jemima fell silent instantly, her eyes widening slightly at his intensity. A few seconds later, seeing the hurt flash across her face, Levi let out a tired sigh and reached out, his large, warm fingers wrapping gently around her hand, squeezing it with an immense, silent desperation. I'm sorry, he murmured softly, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. I cannot afford to lose my focus right now. Losing focus means losing you, and that is an outcome I will not permit. The intense, burning warmth of his fingers wrapped around hers sent a wave of familiar, electric butterflies through her chest. God help her, she realized with absolute clarity that she loved him now. Completely, fiercely, and without any reservations. And that profound truth terrified her more and more every single day. The ultimate betrayal, the calculated strike from the antagonist, happened 2 nights later. Jemima had just returned home from a grueling evening exam at the college when she noticed an unusual, suffocating tension gripping the entire mansion. The domestic staff members completely avoided eye contact with her, looking down at the floor, while the security guards moved nervously, speaking into their earpieces in hushed, panicked tones. Something was wrong. Viscerally, horribly wrong. Before she could even walk toward the kitchen to ask questions, a familiar, predatory figure appeared at the top of the grand marble staircase. Vanessa stood there wearing a deeply satisfied, venomous smile, elegance dripping from her every deliberate movement as she began to descend, and immediately, Jemima's stomach dropped into a bottomless pit of dread. What are you doing inside this house, Vanessa? Jemima asked, her voice turning completely cold as she stood her ground at the bottom of the stairs. Vanessa descended slowly, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble like a countdown timer. I came here out of pure charity to finally tell you the unvarnished truth, little girl, she said smoothly, her voice laced with mock sympathy. Jemima folded her arms tightly across her chest, refusing to let the woman see her shake. I don't care about anything that comes out of your mouth. Leave. Vanessa stopped directly in front of her, her expensive perfume choking the air between them. The truth is that Levi never once intended to keep you permanently, Jemima. You were always a temporary fix. A sharp, agonizing pain flickered briefly across Jemima's face, a vulnerability that Vanessa noticed and celebrated instantly with a cruel smirk. Oh, Vanessa mocked, tilting her head. You poor, naive thing. You actually went and fell completely in love with him, didn't you? Jemima's voice hardened, fighting to maintain her dignity. You're lying. You leaked that contract because you're desperate, and desperate people lie. Am I really lying? Vanessa asked rhetorically, reaching into her leather luxury handbag with a slow, theatrical flair. She pulled out a stack of high-quality photographs and legal documents, thrusting them maliciously into Jemima's hands. Jemima's breath caught instantly in her throat, her eyes scanning the pages. The crisp, undeniable photographs showed Levi meeting privately with his top estate lawyers just 3 weeks earlier, an array of official documents sitting across the table between them. At the top of the main legal page, stamped with the official Suleiman corporate seal, were the devastating words, Post-Contract Settlement Agreement. Jemima's chest tightened so painfully she felt she might faint on the spot. Vanessa smiled softly, a predator savoring the final kill. He was preparing your final exit package, your payoff, before the media scandal even reached its peak. He chose you from that agency because you were convenient, poor, and desperate. Poor girls from Surulere are usually so much easier to control and pay off when the job is done. The cruel, targeted words sliced straight through Jemima's heart, tearing down every single beautiful thing Levi had said to her in his office. Because deep down, in the darkest, most insecure corners of her mind, a part of Jemima had always feared this exact scenario, that Levi would eventually wake up, remember her poverty, and realize she did not belong in his magnificent, elite world. Tears of pure, unadulterated heartbreak burned behind her eyes immediately, blinding her vision. Without uttering another single word, refusing to give Vanessa the satisfaction of watching her break completely, Jemima turned around, ran up the stairs to her room, and locked the door behind her. That very night, under the cover of absolute darkness and the howling wind, Jemima Jackson disappeared into the Lagos rain. By the time Levi returned home from his late corporate battle, the master bedroom was completely empty. The walk-in closet door stood wide open, half of her simple belongings gone, and resting directly in the center of the pristine white bedsheet was her heavy diamond wedding ring, gleaming mockingly under the light. Levi stared at the silver band silently, an icy, violent panic spreading through his veins like poison. No, he whispered, his voice cracking. He turned sharply to find a young housemaid stepping nervously into the room, shaking with fear. Sir, Madam packed a small bag and left several hours ago in a local taxi. Levi's eyes turned completely feral, his voice a roaring gale. Where did she go? She didn't say, sir. She was crying terribly. For the first time in his entire adult life, genuine, paralyzing panic hit the youngest billionaire in Lagos. Levi grabbed his phone immediately, dialing her number over and over again. No answer. Just the hollow, robotic voice of the network provider. He dialed again. Nothing. By midnight, the most feared, ruthless titan in the country had completely mobilized every single security contact, private investigator, tech tracker, and driver he owned on his payroll. Find her. Block the airports. Check the hotels. Scour every street, was the only furious, trembling instruction he gave to his directors. The entire city of Lagos suddenly became far too small for his absolute rage, and far too dangerous for anyone deemed responsible for her flight. 3 agonizing, sleepless days later, through relentless tracking of financial footprints and local taxi routes, Levi finally found her. She was hiding in a tiny, cramped, outdated apartment hidden quietly down a potholed street in the heart of Surulere. The exact moment Jemima opened the worn wooden door and saw his towering, imposing figure standing on the concrete veranda, her breath caught painfully in her throat. Levi looked entirely unrecognizable. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie was completely gone, his hair was messy, and his dark eyes were bloodshot from a total lack of sleep and immense psychological tension. You disappeared on me, he said, his voice hoarse, deep, and raw with an emotion she had never heard before. Jemima looked away immediately, gripping the edge of the doorframe to keep herself steady. You should not be here, Levi. Go back to your mansion. Go back to your elite life. Levi didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped firmly inside the small apartment, his massive presence completely overwhelming the modest living room. You abandoned me, Jemima. You walked away from our home. A flash of pure unbridled pain crossed her face as she turned to face him. You already planned to leave me first, Levi. You had the paperwork ready. Confusion and immediate anger darkened his exhausted features. What on earth are you talking about? Jemima marched over to the small coffee table and threw the stolen settlement photographs down in front of him. Levi looked down at them once, his eyes scanning the layout, and then a realization of pure, murderous understanding hit him instantly. Vanessa, that venomous snake. The dangerous, low calmness in his voice made chills crawl violently down Jemima's spine. She showed me the truth, Levi, Jemima whispered shakily, the tears finally spilling over. I saw the post-contract settlement. I was always just a temporary project to you, a girl to be compensated and discarded when the contract expired. Levi stared at her for several long, suffocating seconds, his chest rising and falling heavily before he finally stepped closer, his voice dropping into a soft, intensely earnest whisper. Jemima, that legal settlement paperwork was not an exit package for a separation. Jemima frowned slightly, her mind trembling. What? Levi reached out, his hands trembling as he took her face gently into his palms, forcing her to look into the absolute honesty of his eyes. That contract was a permanent, irrevocable trust fund. I was legally transferring 40% of my personal wealth, real estate holdings, and lifetime financial protection into your name permanently. I was setting it up so that no matter what happens to me, and no matter what my corrupt family tries to do, you and your mother and Daniel will be protected and wealthy for the rest of your natural lives. I wasn't planning your exit, Jemima. I was planning your permanent security because I cannot imagine a future without you. Her breath caught completely, her jaw dropping as the colossal weight of her mistake, and his immense hidden kindness crashed over her. What? I love you, Jemima, Levi confessed softly, a lone tear escaping his own eye. I have loved you since the night you stood in my library in those pajamas, refusing to give up on your dreams. I don't want a divorce. I want a real life with you. Silence, thick and beautiful, crashed heavily between them as Jemima stared at him through a fresh veil of tears, the walls around her own heart crumbling into dust. Then Levi reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, plastic, and undeniable. A positive pregnancy test he had found in her bathroom trash line back at the mansion before she fled. His eyes locked onto hers with a profound, breathtaking tenderness. Were you really going to tell me about our child eventually? Or were you going to let me live in darkness? Tears filled her eyes completely as she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face into his shoulder as he held her with a fierce, protective grip that promised to never let her go. Because suddenly in that tiny Sur-Air apartment, everything had changed forever, and karma had finally brought two broken souls home. Sometimes the people in this life who are universally judged as cold, unfeeling, untouched, and completely out of reach with their emotions do not just become that way overnight. Something catastrophic pushed them to that hardened point. It could be the agonizing loss of a loved one, a devastating heartbreak, or a brutal betrayal from the people who should have cared for them. In this powerful, instructive story, Jemima did not fall for Levi in the traditional fairy tale way of meeting a soulmate. She met him because she was drowning in the harsh realities of social inequality, desperately needing a miracle to scale up her life and save her family. And Levi, a man broken by grief and surrounded by corporate wolves, was willing to provide that stability she so deeply desired through a cold contract. But in the beautiful, unscripted process of protecting her, he fell deeply, truly, and irrevocably in love with her pure heart. It was a love that was whole, a loyalty that withstood the ultimate test of high society malice and public scandal. Even though they faced a dark storm of manipulation from envious antagonists like Vanessa, true love and pure intentions will always pierce through the thickest armor. This story serves as a profound life lesson for all of us. It teaches us to love fiercely and without holding back, even when life corners us into the most difficult circumstances. Whatever beautiful energy comes out of you, loving someone truly and honestly is never your loss. It is always the loss of those who were too blind or too arrogant to appreciate it. True wealth is not found in the crystal chandeliers of a banana island penthouse, It is found in the unshakable loyalty of a soul that stays. Therefore, my amazing, beautiful story lovers, thank you so much for always holding me down, for staying around this channel, and for constantly watching these dramatic journeys unfold with me. I would absolutely love to hear your profound thoughts about Jemima and Levi's ultimate triumph over karma in the comment section below. Are you happy Vanessa's malicious plan completely backfired? Let me know your opinions. Make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel right now because we are officially back, stronger than ever, and ready to serve you the absolute best, most captivating emotional stories online. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Stay blessed, and bye for now.